So we are really talking about a paradigm shift in how we look at the meaning and the future of corporations, and also what you just mentioned, that if the board is really the microcosm of the interest of all these stakeholders, it perhaps needs to go beyond just the shareholders. I come to you now, Amitabh, and I think it's a great segment, the third part of our conversation, really, the major shifts in governance that we can see in the next decade, the 2020. I mean, 2020 has been a defining year, really, on various counts. I mean, it's a year which one would like to forget, but has having fundamental shift on various things. In that context, perhaps give us, some segment to 3 or 4 large ideas or trends that you see where we go from when we talk about the governance perspective at large.
So maybe I'll just do one, and then maybe Mr. Shroff and I can throw it in together, because we've sort of thought through some different types of things. Just as a continuation, of the purpose conversation that we've been having around what is the future of corporation. Colin Mayer's entire focus has been to sort of say that you need to rethink that the idea of the corporation is not to be able to produce profits, but actually to produce solutions. So if you sort of break up the problems of the world into various categories, and the focus of the conversation of the corporation will then become how close am I to getting to a solution of whatever is the problem that humanity has identified, that is what will drive progress in a much more holistic manner. And the issue of identifying those problems has also already been done. So the UN has set out these sustainable development goals that they have identified 17 categories of problems that have been identified. And unless we are able to align corporations with actually getting to that, governments themselves will not be able to achieve those goals. And I think that is the mindset shift that needs to happen very fundamentally. That as a society which includes how capital sort of runs through. So Vanguard is actually running pension fund money. So there are ordinary citizens who go out and work, put their money into pension funds, which then put out their money into these big, massive investment houses like BlackRock and Vanguard, etc. So money is actually very cyclical, and the idea is to get to that point where there is pressure at all levels to make this fundamental shift, and that is something that will necessarily happen. The other big shift that we will see is more peculiar to India, not so much the world, because in the world this has already been an established concept, is that of class action. India has not seen governance become a mainstream conversation except for the high profile matters where it takes up, the front page of most of the big papers for a while, unless it's a very high profile company. In all other situations, governance is a byline that they sort of say, okay, if SEBI asks us some questions, we'll see how to deal with it. But once the class action regime got notified in June last year, we ourselves see that companies are willing to sit up and take notice. They know that now the risk is real. It is not, people have heard of the famous class actions where decisions of the board result in millions and millions of dollars being given as compensation through a class action mechanism. And that is something that we will see change the way boards discharge their obligations today. I'll give you a simple example. We've talked about stakeholder model of governance. We've talked about how they have to be trade-offs. Normally it would be, everybody internalizes those trade-offs and comes to a decision. Today, because of the fear of class actions, there is a lot more deliberate discussion that is happening. There is a lot of actual recording of the discussion, because in the event this entire issue is reopened in 5 years from now through a class action, there is actually a record of how that conversation happened. Directors have some defenses that they're inbuilding into their decision-making process today so that they will be able to defend it later. These are very, very hard decisions that people are taking, but it is changing board conduct.
No, I sort of quite agree with that. So there are two things. One is the class action threat, and we're just one judicial innovation away from that becoming reality. But the entire framework is there. Somebody has to just put the switch on. The equipment, the legal equipment is all in place. So that's on the class actions. If Indian companies are accessing US or Western capital, I think they need to realize that it comes as a package. And one of the things that comes as a package is this variety or this brand of accountable capitalism and accountability in the West happens to the judicial system, namely class actions. This was the piece that was sort of missing in the past. You can't cherry pick and say, I just like your money, but by the way, I'm not going to be accountable for it in the same sense that you're used to in other markets of the world. And that I think is one change that that will happen. It has to come. It's a whole package. You can't cherry. The second one, which I think we started developing in the first part of the conversation but didn't complete, is that of big data, where with technology, big data, and greater access to technology tools, that the market will find its own way of governance. You can't lie to the market or just put out some shabby disclosure and expect that people will swallow that. If that, you can't lie to the people all of the time. You can't fool all the people all of the time. It's important. And big data will catch you. So you can't put out a disclosure which would say my company is doing great, my sales are so and so, I've got so much market share. Somewhere when you say that, some red light will go up on somebody's computer in the regulator's office who's using AI-based big data tools, which will say, hey, this is a lie. And then you run into a sort of problem. And these tools already exist, and the regulators already have it. This is not science fiction, this is today's reality.
Mr. Shroff, why question capitalism now is the question to ask. Is the basic premise on which corporations are founded. We're talking about responsible capitalism here. So are we also suggesting that the modes of investing like impact investing is going to become more mainstream? Is that a great sort of takeaway from this? We have seen that, large shareholders in the US, coming into the agreement and signing a pact that we will only do what is responsible capitalism. So basically we're questioning capitalism now.
Okay, so if I've been misunderstood to mean that I'm a socialist, I'm not. I am a capitalist at heart because I think capitalism is a very purifying concept. But I think what we're talking about is capitalism 2.0, which is responsible capitalism, as opposed to selfish capitalism. Because selfish capitalism creates too many inequalities, whereas responsible capitalism is a kind of capitalism with a dose of philosophy attached. And when you combine these two, then you sort of get a better outcome. So we're not talking about rejecting capitalism. We're not talking about rejecting the concept of a joint stock company. I think we need to retain both because it does manage to innovate for society. It provides solutions. What Amita mentioned is that the original idea of a corporation was to find solutions. And that's what gave it the social license to operate. I mean, all organizations, including yours and mine, need a social license to operate. And that social license to operate comes from what are you trying to solve for? I'm trying to solve for access to justice, and you're trying to solve for truth. So what everybody has a social purpose and a social license to operate. So corporations need to go back to their original idea of examining what is it that they're there for, and so long as they can combine their purpose with that, with their actions, with their purpose, they will create very profitable businesses, and I think will also do justice to their social license to operate.
So I would actually.
I'm not questioning capitalism at all. In fact, I think it's a wonderful idea. It has created prosperity for thousands and millions of people, but it needs to move to the next stage. Amita?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that, the idea that investors are going only towards impact investing in the sense of responsible capitalism, there are two types. One is where they invest only after they know that you are in the zone of impact investing. But the more common function is actually where they invest, but they take their stewardship role as an investor very seriously and guide the corporation towards more sort of wholesome, socially relevant solution finding, not just profit related drivers. So that is a different way. You're being responsible as an investor. You're not sort of coming into the annual meeting and saying, "Is bar profit itna kyun low hai?" You're actually walking into the annual report and at the annual meeting and saying your business sustainability report does not address these 5 areas that are crucial to the entire sort of both to community as well as to environment, and that is what will drive responsible capital.
I think we spoke about, it's a very interesting and meaningful conversation, unraveling so many deep insights. I also want to sort of talk about, Mr. Shroff, how do the equations change perhaps for gig economy? And that's a very interesting and an important growing economy that we have, the gig economy. We spoke about perhaps the large corporations and the more established ones and how the purpose in the future could change. Please, if you can throw some light and color on the gig economy aspect.
So, short answer is I don't know because it's still very early days of the sort of gigification of our economy. But it is, I think, it's going to impact every organization. Given the, we are today talking about work from home. It's soon going to be work from village, and you have those kind of developments as well. Because what we have done is, what this crisis has done is fundamentally challenge the office centricity of the work model. Which doesn't mean that offices will not exist. Of course, I think they will. But it will be a mix and match. So you will have two cultures. One is the office culture, and then the sort of the secondary culture, which could be work from home, work from village, or complete gig. And the rules will be very different. What are the rules in relation to accountability? How do you today, at least say, for example, in a service industry like ours, a lot of what we do and also what we get paid for is input. I think the model of how people are employed and compensated will change to output. I don't care, I mean, it might lead to, I don't care whether you work 6 hours or 8 hours, have you delivered what I asked you to or not. I'm not going to compensate you on 8 hours of your time. I'm going to compensate you on, did you produce X, which is what was expected from you. These are very fundamental changes because then you are measuring output, not input. Your measurement of quality will be very different. The new metric of quality would be have you produced a zero defect document. So every defect you get minus point. We just take some random examples. So the culture of work in the office-centric environment and the non-office-centric environment will have some similarities because they're loyal to the same corporation. But the rules of engagement will be very different. And this has kind of yet to be invented. There will be technology and cyber related issues, confidentiality issues, ethical issues, mental health issues as well. We in the past, when we say we sort of brought office back home, it was just kind of a weekend thing, or you had to sign some document or read a piece of paper 1 or 2 hours at home. Now the whole office has come home. It's fundamentally different. And what happens there when you do that is a part of the home gets pushed to the side. What social implications that will have on a long-term basis, I don't know. So headline answer, I don't know, but I can see hundreds of issues arising from this, all of which are solvable, but people will have to think through this.
So there's one other big change that will happen through the gig economy on corporate culture, which is a big part of the conversation that governance actually drives, which is the fact that the gig economy will allow for a number of women to come into the workforce who were otherwise not at all able to access the office environment. And that is going to fundamentally change how you think of work product, how you think of work, what kind of work can be done by who. And that will change a lot of things across the board.
At least I'm not worried about that because we are majority women, so I think we are doing great.
No, now we will be more super majority women.
We need to have reservations
for men. That's a different kind of problem you're dealing with here.
I think the way, the kind of skills and the kind of EQ that women may bring to the work culture and workforce will be very interesting. It will definitely add a certain creativity. I think I don't think men are not creative, but I think it will certainly bring a different dimension to how organizations are designed.
That's interesting. Now we sort of spoke about the positive, perhaps spin-offs or takeaways from the gig economy also. Amit, I want to talk to you specifically about this entire conversation on director liability and D&O insurance, in the context of governance. Can you perhaps throw some light on that?
Sure. So, this is again another thing that everybody is sort of concerned about, director liability lagega, but we've not really had any actual cases where directors have had to go out of pocket or where there was an actual monetary consequence to being on the board. Yes, there are some embarrassment, there is some loss of reputation and that kind of cost to being on the board and not discharging your duty, but the monetary implications have not yet hit India. This decade is going to see that change. This decade is going to see that directors will actually have a cost for not actually doing their duty. That cost is going to be substantial. So that is actually going to drive a lot more focus on to how D&O insurance is going to become a mainstream product on the financial side. We actually did this study last year, and as of last year, we'd spoken to the top 5 companies that provide D&O insurance, and not a single one of them had actually had a situation where a D&O insurance was called. So, it's like free premium for them. So, they don't even actually address, what kind of risk there is, how they price that risk is also so feeble and so basic and fundamental. It is not really, looking at, does it have a strong governance structure? Is there a chance of a payout? So, all of those is something that the Indian markets are going to see innovations on. Not unique to the world, places like America and Europe have very, very sophisticated D&O insurance products. It's just not something that has come to India yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's one, if I can add, I think
Sure.
a lot of these mandates have been prescriptive and have come from the regulator. Whenever there is some kind of behavioral expectation, you have a schedule in the company that 5 pages about the director will do. We actually have a 5-page schedule in the Companies Act on what independent directors do, and actually no human being can comply. I call it the kind of the Gandhi annexure, because only Gandhiji could, and sometimes not sure even he could comply with that. Then you have SEBI, which will lay down lots of rules. The difference in what Amita was pointing out is that this is going to come from the judiciary. It is going forward, and this is what happened in the West. Nobody in the West, the boards are worried about what will happen if they get sued in a class act, what the jury will decide as the damages. Yeah, of course they worry about what SEC thinks, but they're far more worried about what will happen if they get sued. That is what drives behavior.
These are like very, meaningful revelations. And I want to go back to Mr. Shaw, what you just said, that, this entire thing of a villainless crime, and we are sort of playing with that unknown. So do you think the pandemic will unearth major governance issues in corporations? We have seen some case of frauds in public companies, the very famous being the Satyam crisis, but they were more different, they were more financial kind of frauds. Can there be new kind of frauds or governance crisis, which the pandemic can unearth?
The moment you start with fraud, I mean, we are assuming there's a villain there. So that's still playing out the old playbook of there's a bad guy and the good guy. I think the difference in the current crisis, the governance crisis, which I call the villainless one, is how do you prepare for a new tomorrow which has yet to be imagined, where all the plates are moving, and you're trying to. It's like a 8-dimensional matrix where every part is moving, and you're trying to design for that and make sure that you not only make the right business decision, but you also make the right ethical decision. So I think the ethics, is going to be a big part of how this future governance conversation works.
How should startups maneuver?
For example, technology and the whole ethics of technology or the ethics of artificial intelligence. How are you going to design ethical technology? If the next 10 years is the decade that belongs to technology, there's a hell of a lot of ethics that has to be built into technology as well. Now that's what I call the villainless, the kind of villainless governance problem.
This short we spoke
about. We
about.
ourselves are the villain because we made wrong design decisions.
That's an interesting way to put it. And we spoke about, how corporations are redefining. There'll be new ideas coming on, the future of corporation. I know a lot of investment is coming into the so-called, nimble-footed, agile business models, primarily driven by tech and also run by young entrepreneurs. One has not necessarily seen a lot of, such, you say that, in terms of corporate governance standards, there seem to be gray areas. On how the word is not really out. What would be your advice to startups then?
I would ask Amita to take that question.
Yeah, I think startups are the ones that are actually going to face what we're talking about. That is, next generation governance, where it's a very flat. Most startups, their big focus is the fact that they're very flat organizations. So they don't have a command and control sort of approach. That a significant portion of what they're trying to do is done through collaboration, not so much actually doing it through the within the same company, but that you collaborate across different. So the ownership of IP is a very complicated space that comes out, and therefore valuations are also very different drivers. The biggest governance fights that are happening today, not in 2.0, which we think to change, but even just today, the fact that when you start with Series A and then you go all the way to Series B or Series A, you sort of renegotiated that shareholders agreement so many times. So there are layers and layers and layers of governance rights that are embedded across different types of and that makes for very complicated outcomes, and that becomes a problem in two situations. One of in a situation where you don't have cash, there isn't really that much of an outcome because there's nothing really to fight about. And if you're very successful, also that's not something that is going to. But if you're at that survival space where you have just enough to survive, that is when the governance fights at the company level become really prevalent, and that is where getting in space, getting into a space where you have been building up a governance culture throughout, so that you can actually handle that survival space. It actually is the way you will go past that post.
So that's a piece of advice going on to startups, building a governance culture, especially on a startup mode. Please, Mr. Shroff. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think this is an interesting point where I think I should raise the topic of role of a promoter. So the traditional model of a role of a promoter is actually for a controlling interest, usually about 51%. Is a sort of gata of the business, and he will drive the future. And a lot of our corporate and governance thinking has been based on that premise. And the accountability and the liability framework also proceeds on that. If something goes wrong in the company, promoter ko pakdo. If you want to list a company, you can't file an offer document without the photograph and the passport and driving license of the promoter. So there is a kind of a disproportionate, almost godlike kind of existence which the promoter has in our corporate imagination of the kind of influence they have, as well as the accountability. Ultimately, the buck stops there. So now go to since we're talking about startups, and before Amita's example, by the time you are at Series H, the promoter has come down to single digits, but he's still carrying that responsibility. So why would you hold a 9% fellow or a 10% or even a 15% fellow accountable in the same way that you hold a 51% guy? So
it's a very important question to ask.
Shades of
we are seeing this play out.
Yeah, we're seeing this play out, and they can't do anything. And then the investors who are now holding that balance 85 or 90%, they are concerned with only one thing. Whereas that long-termism which that promoter has, but who has now lost the ability to drive the destiny of the company because he's at the mercy of the balance, and he's also at the mercy of agreements that he never even read when he signed them. Because at that stage, all that he wants is, where do I sign? Where's the check?
I think we covered the whole gamut of things. This has been a very meaningful conversations around corporate governance. And Mr. Shroff, I would like to sort of also ask you, did you perhaps manage to meet your grandchildren yet? We are entering the first phase of unlock now. From our last conversation.
I'll be having those movies coming soon. I'm at that stage now.
Okay, my trivia question to you is that the last time you actually sort of labeled the entire IBC phenomenon as a famous Ajit Kumar joke. If you were to give me a joke today, what would that be?
We are missing the cashew nuts.
That is really going to the board directors. And if you were to give me one advice from one corporate interaction that you had with one CEO, which really stuck with you for long, and perhaps is reminiscent to you in these times of the difficult times of governance, what is that one conversation? Give us some color or banter there.
Obviously, sort of without names, but I think some of the most meaningful conversations I've had with directors or promoters is where they've been able to sort of imagine a world 10, 15 years down the line, which has got nothing to do with the sort of present, and also design a kind of a governance framework to support that. So I've had some of those conversations, and those are the ones that really stick with me of brilliant entrepreneurs in the country who are able to think generations ahead. So those are the and they're actually they may sound more profit oriented, but they actually make a deep impact on society.
Interesting. Amit, I come to you now. How is it about doing deal making in virtual environment? Is that the new normal for you?
Yeah, it is very much the new normal. But like I said, the clients expect that you're really available 24/7. We were already a firm where we were available to clients 24/7, and now it has just become back to us.
Okay.
I am very thankful that we have the ability to be in a space where we can continue to work something like this. I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah. I think we have some questions from the audiences also. I think we should do justice to that. There is one question, I think, Mr. Shroff, maybe you can take a stab at this. How role of Office of Independent Director will and should shape up going forward? That's a question from Ashok Maheshwari.
Yeah, I'll take it and I'll get Amita to also add to it.
Sure.
So that role is already changing. It's as I said in my introductory remarks, I told non-executive that N is dropping off, and at least through this crisis, the independent directors are far more engaged, and they want to offer their services also to the management to help them navigate out of the crisis. At the back of the mind, there may be liability issues, but what is driving most of them actually is the desire to make sure that they do the right thing. So I've seen that change, and it's of course it is individual driven. Not everybody is in the same boat, but as a general principle, independent directors are far more involved in guiding their companies through this crisis.
I think there was a period maybe over the last 10 years where we were seeing an exodus of good independent directors out of the market. The one thing that we are sort of hearing in the market right now is a re-entry. A lot of high caliber senior professionals think that this might be their contribution back to society and are thinking of actually taking on independent director roles given the expanded role that they will be taking and their contribution back to society. It is a very impactful role for them to take on. So we might see a reversal of the exodus we've seen in the last decade.
Okay.
There's one more reason for that. One is of course kind of self-realization that they should contribute, but I think the attitude of companies towards them is also changing. They're more welcoming.
There's one more question, Shroff. What is the status of litigation funding in India? Have any Indian entities raised litigation funding in India or abroad?
Amita, you take this one. I mean, this is a long topic in probably 2 seconds.
Yeah, it's a long topic, but actually litigation funding in countries like Australia went hand in hand with the whole class action regime. So that is something that we are watching closely. We do think that litigation funding will come even in India hand in hand with the class action regime as and when it starts later on in this decade. As on date, a classic litigation funding is not something that India or big Indian corporates have seen. Yes, some muqadmas have been sold and bought in various informal sectors, assessments, but not really in the company space. In the EPC space, we are seeing companies actually figure out ways to leverage capital on pending claims. They're not doing it through the standard litigation funding models. They actually move the claim into a separate company and raise funding there. But it's all work in progress. Again, something that we will see happen in quite a big way this coming decade.
Okay, there's one more
I think
question.
contrary to popular perception, it's not illegal in India. I mean, people think it's sympathy, but there are many sort of zones in litigation funding where it is possible to do. Arbitration is one area where it would be.
Okay, there's one more question. Will India also adopt senior NED principles as the UK markets have?
It's possible, but I don't really think. I think the way we're sort of moving towards is what Mr. Shroff said, is to drop the whole N part of how we are thinking of our directors engaging on the board. that everybody is in it together and that we will get through this together, and that is probably going to be a bigger driver. As of now, I don't think the government is going to, or regulator is going to make any material changes on roles and responsibilities of directors for the next couple of years.
There's one more question. I think it's a pretty pointed kind of question. I think it's for you, Amita. In India, which is a promoter-driven and controlled companies, how independent are the directors really? Even if they are high-caliber professionals, shouldn't the law also have some protection for the IDs too? Amita's foreboding warning that this is a decade for directors to be careful needs to be reviewed in this light. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I think the government is trying hard to bring in sort of safeguards and protections for independent directors. So there have been circulars that have been issued saying that don't go out and try and attack independent directors or put them into sort of regulatory jam unless there is specific evidence against them. Those safeguards will evolve. But like I said, the jurisprudence around this is yet to evolve. As and when we see cases come up during the course of this decade, we will see that a lot of these things become much clearer. Right now, we're playing in gray space.
Mr. Shroff, there's one question for you. Do you think any amendments expected in Companies Act?
But what does that question mean?
I don't know. I mean, it's a question that you
Amendment
think
for what?
for the Companies Act expected.
So they're always amending something or the other. So I specifically on this conversation, I don't think so. In fact, just now it's been softened. As you know, that whole decriminalization thing has happened. So it's, which is a good thing because I think it has gone too far. But I think the real innovation that will come is, I think the next is going to be a judicial innovation.
Okay. There's one
Not a
question.
legislative one.
There's one question from Narayan Shankar that if you drop the N from NED, aren't they crossing the LOC and becoming more liable, as it is no longer going to be knowledge attributable through board process?
Yes, but I think I just want to explain the context of my observation, and I think the dropping of the N is not as a matter of form. It is a matter of the practical reality that just now, even though they are non-executive and legally and statutorily they are non-executive, but they are more engaged. So it's probably NED now become engaged non-executive directors.
I think we'll just take one last question. I think that will be a great wrap up to this meaningful conversation. I think it's a light question. I think we've already touched upon this. How will life change for investor and nominee directors?
How will life change for investor nominee directors? I think on a lighter note, I think we'll have to work harder.
Okay, so that's a good end for this conversation. Until the time we see you next, goodbye and good luck. Thank you for being patient, audience, and thank you, Mr. Shroff and Amita, for joining us. And we'll see you goodbye and good luck for the next episode. Till then, please
see you next Saturday.
See you next Saturday. Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you.